You know how they say that sometimes you can feel a stare, like icy fingers trailing down your spine? That's how it began for me, out here in this forsaken cabin, nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest hint of civilization. The kind of place you'd stumble upon only if you were desperately running from the law, nursing a broken heart, or, like me, just foolishly seeking solitude. But as my luck would have it, instead of peace, I found myself trapped, nursing not just a shattered spirit but a broken leg, courtesy of a reckless skiing tumble. Life in the cabin was mundane, a stark contrast to the adrenaline-fueled life I led back in the city. Each day was a repetitive loop of keeping the fireplace ablaze, a feeble barrier against the biting cold, and rationing the dwindling supplies in my pantry. The silence was a stark canvas, amplifying every crack and pop of the firewood, every whisper of wind against the window panes. The isolation was palpable, suffocating, a thick blanket smothering any semblance of the hustle and bustle I was accustomed to. It was during one of these long evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blue and gold, that I first sensed it. An inexplicable shift in the atmosphere, a prickling on the back of my neck, a feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. I brushed it off initially, chalking it up to the cabin fever, the eerie whispers of the woods, or perhaps the unsettling tales told by the locals. They spoke of the woods being alive, of spirits and entities from tales old as time itself. Guardians of the forest, or malevolent watchers, depending on whom you asked. I laughed it off, a city boy unaccustomed to the superstitions of the rural heartlands. But deep down, a seed of unease was planted, germinating in the back of my mind. The Watcher, as I began to call it, was nothing more than a fleeting shadow at first, a mere trick of the light as the last rays of the sun retreated, leaving behind the oppressive embrace of the night. But there was a feeling, a visceral primitive alarm ringing in the depths of my being, telling me that out there, beyond the fragile safety of my cabin walls, something was observing, waiting. As the nights grew longer and the days colder, the presence became more pronounced, a silent observer in the encroaching darkness. I tried to shake the feeling, to drown it in logic and reason, but the wilderness has a way of stripping away the veneer of civilization, exposing the primal fears lurking in our subconscious. And so with each sunset, I felt the Watcher's gaze, heavy upon me, a palpable weight of anticipation, and something else, something darker, hungrier. I was a world away from everything I knew, isolated, vulnerable, a sitting duck with a leg as useless as my dwindling optimism. In the vast whispering expanse of the wilderness, I was not alone. Despite the growing dread that clung to me like the frost on the cabin windows, life had to continue, broken leg and all. That's where Cousin Peter came into the picture, my lifeline to the remnants of civilization, my bridge back to a world that suddenly seemed as distant as a forgotten dream. He'd ride in on his snowmobile every few days, a beacon of normalcy in my increasingly strange seclusion, bringing with him not just supplies from the nearest town, but snippets of news, gossip, and that human connection I didn't realize I'd been starving for until it was nearly out of reach. Peter was the polar opposite of me in almost every way. Where I was reserved and contemplative, he was loud, brash, and carried an infectious laugh that seemed to banish the shadows, at least temporarily. He found my situation amusing. The city boy holed up in the middle of nowhere, at the mercy of the elements and his own cooking. City boy spooked by his own shadow, he'd tease, dismissing my uneasy mentions of feeling watched with a wave of his hand and that booming laugh that echoed off the cabin walls. But as the days shortened and the night stretched out like an endless dark canvas, I noticed subtle changes in him. His visits became more sporadic, his usual robust banter seemed forced, and his eyes, once full of mirth, now darted nervously, avoiding mine, as if he was holding back a tide of secrets. I tried to probe, to understand what had caused the shift, but Peter shrugged off my questions with vague answers and a haste to change the subject. Then came the day that would forever be etched in my memory. The day Peter's facade finally cracked. He arrived earlier than usual, the roar of his snowmobile shattering the morning silence like a gunshot. His face was pale, eyes wide, carrying an urgency I had never seen in him before. The jovial cousin I knew was gone, replaced by a man who looked as if he had stared into the abyss and seen something staring back. His laughter was gone, his banter reduced to clipped, distracted replies. He unloaded the supplies mechanically, his usual stories of town events and mutual acquaintances replaced by an oppressive silence that hung between us like a thick fog. When I broached the topic of the Watcher, his reaction was visceral. A sharp intake of breath, a swift glance towards the tree line, and a sudden, urgent insistence that I should consider leaving, at least until spring. But before I could press further, extract more from his uncharacteristically tight-lipped demeanor, he was back on his snowmobile, casting me one last meaningful look, a silent plea, or perhaps a warning, before he disappeared into the snow, leaving me alone with a burgeoning sense of unease that quickly grew into an all-consuming paranoia. That night, the Watcher felt closer, bolder, as if Peter's visit had somehow affirmed its presence, given it a tangible form in the darkness beyond my cabin. The shadows seemed to press closer against the windows, the wind whispering, not just through the trees but through the very walls of my retreat, carrying with it a sense of impending doom. After Peter's last unsettling visit, the cabin felt more like a prison than ever, the walls seemingly closing in with each passing hour. The sense of isolation deepened, a tangible thing, as if the wilderness itself had decided to cut me off from the rest of the world, leaving me stranded in a sea of white, an island of despair in the endless snow. It was in this growing crucible of solitude that the incidents began to escalate, each one more inexplicable, more unnerving than the last. Initially, they were almost dismissible, an odd noise here, a misplaced item there. Things that isolation could trick the mind into misinterpreting. But soon, denial became impossible. The footprints appeared first, a series of indistinct impressions in the fresh snow around the cabin, each one chillingly larger than any human or known animal could make. They circled the perimeter, a silent testament to the Watcher's physical presence, its silent rounds a mockery of my captivity. I told myself they were the result of melting snow, of shadows playing tricks, but the lie was a weak balm to the cold dread settling in my bones. Then came the whispers, a sinister chorus that rose with the wind, carrying within it voices from my past. Peter's hearty laugh, now twisted into something mocking, my ex's soothing tone turned chilling, even my own voice beckoning me into the dark. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to drown them out, but they seemed to bypass my physical hearing, embedding directly into my mind, an invasive, relentless call. The breaking point came with the snowmobile, my last link to the outside world, now rendered useless. I found it one morning, not as I had left it, but dissected, its parts laid out with almost surgical precision, a grotesque parody of an autopsy. The engine, the heart of the machine, was meticulously dismantled, its components scattered in a trail leading into the woods, a macabre breadcrumb path I dared not follow. The same fate had befallen Peter's truck, which I found on a desperate, limping venture outside, hoping against hope that he had returned. The vehicle sat silent, a frozen carcass, its innards gutted with brutal efficiency, leaving it nothing more than a hollow shell, a monument to my growing despair. The realization that I was truly alone, truly abandoned, hit me then with the force of a physical blow. The Watcher wasn't just some residual figment of my imagination, a byproduct of the isolation and my injured state. It was real, and it was toying with me, stripping away my hopes of escape one by one, leaving me naked to my fears. Night became a period of torment, each sound a potential harbinger of some new horror, each shadow a potential veil for my unseen tormentor. Sleep fled from me, leaving me to count the hours until the dubious safety of dawn in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at the slightest noise. my eyes straining in the dark for any sign of the watcher. The cabin, once a quaint refuge from the cacophony of city life, had transformed into a sinister echo chamber, amplifying my growing fears and the relentless isolation imposed by the surrounding wilderness. My every waking moment was consumed by the dread that something malevolent was lurking just beyond the thin veil of reality. Its presence a palpable force that drained my spirit and gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I clung to the remnants of my rational mind, desperately trying to anchor myself to something, anything that could provide a semblance of normalcy. I attempted to maintain a routine, to keep the fire burning, to ration my dwindling supplies. But these acts felt hollow, automated, as if I was watching myself from a distance, a spectator to my own slow unraveling. The isolation gnawed at me, a relentless tide eroding the shores of my sanity. The silence of the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, filled with the whispers of shadows and the echoes of my own thoughts, which grew darker with each passing day. I found myself speaking aloud, if only to break the monotonous quiet, to assure myself I still existed in some tangible form, that I hadn't yet faded into the fabric of the nightmare that my life had become. The turning point came one chilling evening, when the boundaries between reality and the creeping madness that haunted me began to blur. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, forming grotesque shapes that danced in the periphery of my vision, taunting, mocking. It was then, in a moment of terror and clarity, that I saw it, the Watcher. It was no mere trick of the light, no fleeting shadow to be rationalized away. It stood at the edge of the tree line, a hulking, indistinct form that seemed both part of the darkness and yet apart from it, a malignancy on the natural world. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a malevolent light, a cold, hungry gleam that seemed to strip away the facade of my supposed safety, laying bare the primal fear that had taken root in my heart. It didn't advance, didn't need to. Its mere presence was an intrusion, a violation of the thin shred of security I had clung to. It was as if it wanted me to know, truly know, that I was never alone, that it was always there, watching, waiting, savoring my despair. I reacted the only way I could, retreating into the cabin, a makeshift fortress that now felt as flimsy as paper. I fortified what I could, boarding up the windows, barricading the door, creating barriers that I knew were as much about trapping myself in as keeping the Watcher out. The sound of my heart pounding in my ears was a constant companion as I worked, drowning out the night sounds, the whispers, the insidious doubt that perhaps this was all a descent into madness. But no, the Watcher was real as the cold seeping through the cracks, as real as the dwindling light of the fire that I kept alive as a beacon, a pitiful declaration of my existence in the face of the encroaching darkness. I spent the nights huddled near the embers, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin, each sound a potential herald of my nightmare come to life. The realization that I was utterly trapped, that escape was a now distant dream, clung to me with a suffocating grip. I was caught in the web of the Watcher, ensnared in a game whose rules I didn't understand, whose outcome seemed increasingly inevitable. The cabin had become my cell, and I the unwilling participant in a twisted vigil, waiting for a fate that hovered just out of sight, biding its time. In the eerie pre-dawn light, the world outside the cabin appeared deceptively peaceful, a pristine landscape untouched by the horror that lurked within and beyond its walls. But the beauty of the snow-covered woods was lost on me now, replaced by a bone-deep chill that no fire could dispel. I had reached the end of my tether, a man teetering on the brink of madness, living on borrowed time in a frozen hell. As I recorded my final thoughts, my voice seemed distant, a hollow echo of the man I once was. This was no longer about survival. It was about leaving behind a warning, a beacon for anyone foolish enough to wander into this cursed place. The isolation, once a balm to my weary soul, had become a poison, seeping into my very bones, leaving me exposed to the unseen horrors that stalked the edge of darkness. I realized then with a clarity that cut through the fog of fear that the Watcher was more than just a creature. It was a manifestation of the forest itself, of the desolation and despair that had claimed this land long before I arrived. It was the guardian of a boundary I had unwittingly crossed, a sentinel for a realm where human sanity was but a fragile, fleeting thing. The dawn brought no comfort, no sense of a new beginning. Instead, it marked the closing of an unseen door, the last sliver of hope fading with the night. The Watcher, ever present, seemed to bask in the growing light, its form now a constant shadow that loomed over everything I thought was safe. It was a reminder that daylight was no sanctuary, that there were things in this world beyond understanding, beyond control. I leave this recording, this testament of my final days, not as a tale of heroism, but as a solemn warning. To those who hear this, understand that there are places in this world where darkness reigns, where unseen eyes follow your every move. Stay away from the isolated corners of the earth, from the silence that speaks in whispers of madness. Beware the silent watchers, the unseen dangers that prey upon the lost and the broken. Do not venture into the wilderness unguarded. Do not believe that the light of day can protect you from the horrors that lurk in the shadows. The thin veil between our world and what lies beyond is easily torn, and once crossed, there is no turning back. The Watcher is close now. I can feel its icy breath, a whisper against the soul, a promise of an end that is both a terror and a release. This cabin, this forest, will soon claim me, as it has claimed others before. But let my voice be a lighthouse in the dark for those who might follow, a beacon urging you to turn back before it's too late. And so, with the sunrise painting false promises on the horizon, I make my final plea. Listen to this tale, learn from my folly, and if by some grace you can, like and subscribe, perhaps share my story. Maybe, just maybe, it will save someone else from this fate. And hey, if you can, like and subscribe, maybe someone will hear this before it's too late for them too.